most of you are already deep into the process of trying to prepare for Christmas. You may even have a checklist of things that you're slowly working your way through as that date moves closer. So you're buying gifts, you're putting up decorations, you're planning meals. Maybe you're planning a trip back home to see your family, or depending on your situation, maybe you're trying to figure out how you're going to get out of taking a trip back home to see your family. I don't know how it is for you, but there are certain things about the Christmas season that over time, it wasn't always this way, but over time, I've started to really enjoy. The Christmas events at the church, the family time, the Christmas parties, the Christmas Eve service, all of that are things that I look forward to. And another thing that I've really grown to enjoy over the years are some of the classic Christmas movies. Now, I'm not talking about like the Hallmark movies, right? Or the kids' movies that are so popular, but some of the classics, and you know what they are. How the Grinch Stole Christmas, Miracle on 34th Street, like that one. Die Hard with Bruce Willis is a good Christmas movie. White Christmas with Bing Crosby, and then, of course, my favorite, and many of your favorites would be It's a Wonderful Life with the great Jimmy Stewart. And one of the things I love about those movies is that you already know how they're going to turn out. Even if you've never seen them before, you know in a Christmas movie, everything turns out okay. Everybody lives happily ever after, as the snow falls, and it always ends on a positive note. Like, you know that the Grinch's heart is going to triple in size. You know Kris Kringle is going to turn out to be Santa Claus. You know Bruce Willis is going to kill all the bad guys and defuse the bomb, just in the nick of time. You know in White Christmas that the two couples are going to fall in love as the snow blankets the countryside. And you know every time you watch Wonderful Life, even if it's year after year, you know that at the end, George Bailey is going to realize he already has everything he needs, and he's going to settle into life in Bedford Falls. You don't have to be an expert to know how these movies turn out. And I think that's one of the reasons they're so popular. There's something sort of comforting about, a predictable ending, especially when you live in a world that seems to be filled with unpredictable endings. You watch the news at night and you see all the chaos around, and then you go flip on a Christmas movie and all the pieces fit into place and everything just sort of feels right. And if somebody were to go back and remake those endings, reshoot those movies, if you were to change the ending, it would change the whole story. That's why whenever you're watching a movie that ends unexpectedly, it's sometimes jarring. There's a plot twist at the end, or something happens that you never saw coming. It leaves you feeling a little bit frustrated, maybe a little bit disoriented. So if you have your Bible or your phone, I want you to turn to John chapter 11. As David said this morning, we're going to look at a story of a family who was desperate to rewrite an ending that was completely unpredictable, and at the same time, they never saw it coming. Over the last few weeks, if you've been with us, we've been slowly working our way through these 7 stories of miracles that Jesus performed that are recorded for us in the Gospel of John. But rather than calling them miracles, this is so important, because once you understand this, you can understand the entire Gospel of John. Rather than calling them miracles, John always calls them signs. And the reason he does that is because a miracle can just be a cool story, but a sign always points you to something else. So the dictionary defines a sign like this. It says a sign is an object whose presence or occurrence indicates the probable presence or occurrence of something else. So in each of these 7 stories, John's purpose is not just so that we would know some cool stuff about some interesting things that Jesus did. His purpose is to tell us something about Jesus so that we'll come to know Jesus. He doesn't just want us to know about Jesus. He wants us to know Jesus. And at the end of his gospel, in John chapter 20, he says it like this. He said, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. So you can go to the other Gospels. You can read about other things he did. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, you may have life in his name. And today, we're going to look at the seventh sign, the last one, the one that most people remember, the one to which all the other signs have been building. And just to review, by this point in his ministry, the opposition to Jesus has reached such a fever pitch that the religious leaders, the church guys, have basically put out a contract on Jesus' life. And so in order to avoid what would be a premature confrontation, Jesus and his disciples have been sort of laying low, sort of skirting around the edges of Judea rather than going into Jerusalem and facing the religious leaders, which is where all of them were located. And that works out pretty well until you get to John chapter 11, when Jesus receives word that one of his closest friends from a family that he has apparently spent a lot of time with over the years has unexpectedly gotten sick and is nearing death. So if you have your Bible open to John chapter 11 on your phone, I want you to look at how John begins this story. Verse 1. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. Now, if I handed you a blank piece of paper and I said, I want you to write down the names of your closest, 4 or 5 friends, just think about whose names would you write down. Hopefully you've got 4 or 5 friends. Hopefully you've got people that you can name just almost immediately. So you think about that. Whose names would you write down? If Jesus were to do that, it's very possible that Mary and Martha and Lazarus would be at or near the top of his list. These are not just random people. These are not just people that Jesus, randomly encountered on his way to something else like some of the other stories we have. These are people that are close to Jesus. They've spent a lot of time with Jesus, and in many ways, they are some of his closest friends. Now, with that in mind, look at what happens in verse 4. When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, so when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Now, you hear that, and if you're anything like me, you think, what? Because that's like the total opposite of what you would expect him to do. In verse 5, John tells us that Jesus loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And then you get to verse 6, and he says he loved them so much that he stayed where he was for 2 more days. Now, what do when you receive word that somebody that you love is sick? What do? Well, if you're like most people, you leave work, you go home, you pack a suitcase, you get in the car, you gas up the car, and you go. You don't stay where you are for 2 more days. But instead of doing what most people do, instead of leaving where he was and going to Lazarus' house immediately, Jesus stayed where he was. And then at the end of verse 7, it says that he stayed there 2 more days, and then he looks at his disciple and he says, hey, it's been 2 days now, let's go to Judea. And you can almost feel everybody looking, thinking, what is he doing? Because that seems to cut against the grain of everything we know about love and friendship and family. It seems out of character that Jesus would wait 48 hours to go when you're in a situation in which every second counts. So why did Jesus wait? He waited because he already knew what he was going to do. Check out verse 8. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back. And Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. After he had said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up. Now, one of the things I hope you've picked up on as we've worked our way through these stories is oftentimes these really dramatic moments, Jesus will make some sort of statement, and his disciples, just like us, will completely misunderstand what he was trying to say. And this is one of those instances. Jesus says, hey, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, and you can almost hear the disciples breathe a sigh of relief, because if Lazarus is asleep, that means he'll eventually wake up, and that means we don't have to go to Judea, because that's where all the bad guys are. That's where the enemies are, and they're excited because now they don't have to go. But so then Jesus, realizing they misunderstood him, speaks up a second time, and this time he leaves no doubt as to what's happening. Check out verse 12. His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake, I'm glad I was not there. Seems kind of strange, doesn't it? Somebody you love has died, and you say, you know what? I'm glad I wasn't there. So that you may believe, but let us go to him. Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of his disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. So if you had to pick a sign to represent this story, it might look like this next sign. Two simple words with a period at the end. For Lazarus, it was the end. His heart had beat for the last time. He'd taken his last breath. His soul had left his body, and it was over. For his sisters, it was also the end. All their dreams of their little, close-knit family, living out their final years together, hanging out together, all of that has come to an end. It was an ending they never saw coming. It was an ending they could have never predicted. And then you keep reading, you find that even for the disciples, they're convinced this is going to lead to their end. I mean, Thomas is the only one that verbalizes it, but everybody was thinking, hey, if we go back there, if we go back where your enemies are located, it's going to be the end for all of us. We're all going to be dead. So what do you do when it feels like the story that you've been writing, or at least the latest chapter that you've been writing, comes to an abrupt and unexpected end? What do you do when the end comes and you never saw it come? As you look at this story, you're going to see how Jesus shows up and he rewrites the ending. He takes what looks like a period at the end of a very short sentence, and he turns it into a comma and begins a new chapter. If you want to follow along, there's an outline at the bottom of your bulletin, and you'll see that the rewriting process starts with a simple invitation, and that's when you invite Jesus in. One of the things I hope you've seen throughout all of these 7 stories that we've looked at is that somewhere in the midst of this rewriting process, Jesus has to get involved, and it's much easier for him to get involved if you invite him in. So one way to think about this, have you ever found yourself maybe watching a movie or reading a book, and you invest 2 or 3 hours in that movie or that book, and you get right to the end, and the ending just sort of leaves you feeling a little bit frustrated, and you walk away and you say, I don't think I would have ended it like that. Maybe you go home, or maybe you're rethinking about the book, and you're thinking about all the different ways they could have ended the movie or ended the book. In the world of film writing, screenwriters will often experiment with 4 or 5 different endings. They call them alternative endings. So when you go to the movie theater, all you see is the one they chose. But on the cutting room floor, there might be 4 or 5 other endings that they experimented with. Sometimes if you buy a DVD, like box set of a movie, it'll say, includes deleted scenes or includes alternative endings, so that you get the opportunity. You can go back. If the movie had ended one way instead of this way, you can see how it would have changed the story. But you can't change the story because you didn't write the story. I mean, all you do, you're a participant in the story. You might be an observer of the story, but you're not really writing the story. If you really wanted to change the ending, you'd have to get in touch with the writer of the story. And that's what Mary and Martha were doing when they sent word to Jesus that his friend Lazarus was sick. Through no fault of their own, they'd run into this this plot twist that they never saw coming. And so rather than just accepting it and taking it as it is, they invited the author of the story to write himself into the story so that he could rewrite the ending to the story. It's important to remember that these three members of this family knew Jesus better than most people. And so they knew that when Jesus gets involved, when Jesus shows up, things start to change. As you look at this story, there are three things in particular that you see happen once Jesus gets involved in this process. And here's the first thing. It's that his presence always brings comfort. When you get to verse 17, after 4 agonizing days of waiting, Jesus finally arrives. Now, you could say that's the good news because he's there, but the bad news is that it's already too late. Lazarus has already been dead for 4 days, which means he was either dead when Jesus got the message or he died soon thereafter. And I want you to check out the way John describes Jesus' arrival in verse 17 of John 11. Here's what it says. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Mary and Martha to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. And then you get to verse 21, and Martha confronts Jesus in a way that most of us here can probably relate to. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now, let me just stop there for a second. You hear that, and you can hear the frustration in her voice. I mean, if you had been there, you would have been able to see the disappointment and the frustration etched all over her face. And some of you know what that's like. Some of you have been in those moments when you wondered when Jesus was coming. Maybe you wondered if Jesus was coming, and you prayed and you prayed and you prayed and nothing happened. And then when it finally did happen, it seemed like it was too late, and you wanted to say to him, like, where were you? Why weren't you here? I mean, I prayed, I sent word, I asked for you to come, and you didn't come. And if only you'd been here, or if only you had been paying attention from wherever you were, none of this would have happened. Like my brother would not have died, my marriage would not have ended, my child would not have gotten sick, my boss would have never laid me off, my family would not have fallen apart, my business would not have went under, my friends would have never stabbed me in the back. I mean, if only you had come when I called you, I'd have never been diagnosed with this disease. If only you'd been paying attention. Some of you know what that's like. Some of you feel that way right now. But however frustrated you might be, or however many unanswered questions you might have, I want you to look at what happens next. Because what happens next, in the very next verse, even though she's understandably frustrated with Jesus, Martha expresses her undaunted faith in Jesus. Check out verse 22. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. It's interesting. You check this out. That the very first words out of Jesus' mouth in response to Martha's frustration are not words of correction, but words of comfort. And he tells her that even though it looks like it's the end of the story, her brother's going to rise again. Of course, she misunderstands. She thinks he's talking about someday that's far off into the future. So Jesus comes back around and he redirects the conversation, and he wants her to know he's not talking about what's going to happen in the future. He's talking about what's going to happen now. And that leads to the second thing, and that's that his promise always provides hope. Check out verse 25. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. Now, whenever somebody died in the ancient world, and especially somebody as prominent as Lazarus must have been, there was a very detailed protocol that the family was expected to follow. If you watched any of Queen Elizabeth's funeral a few weeks, I know somebody took off work to watch that, but if you watched any of that, it wasn't just like a funeral, it was an entire week's worth of stuff that they had to go through. And it was very similar in the Jewish world. The family was expected to hire 2 professional flute players who would provide all this background noise. And then just to make sure it was emotional enough, there was actually these groups of women that you could hire who would come and they would wail and weep over the body of that person. Even though they probably didn't even know that person, they were known as professional mourners. And then in addition to all of that, you'd have all kinds of people from the area who would show up to see who else was there and to see who was a part of the service. So it wasn't just like a little quiet, private memorial service. This was a production. This was something that everybody would have been at. Everybody would have been watching to see who else was there. So there's a part of me that wonders, is even as Jesus and Martha are having this conversation, if they couldn't hear that flute music playing in the background. There's part of me that wonders if they couldn't hear the wailing of those professional mourners. At the very least, 4 days into it, there would have still been a pretty sizable crowd of interested observers. So here they are, and they're surrounded everywhere they look by reminders of death. And so Jesus, knowing that, very quickly redirects the conversation back to life. And in the midst of his conversation, he makes it clear to Martha that sinful, messed up, undeserving, broken people, just like all of us, can experience life. And if you look closely, he says that the path to experiencing life is by believing in him. Verse 26, he says, the one who believes in me will live even though they die. Make sure you understand, Jesus never one time glosses over the reality of death. And if you don't hear anything else that anybody says today, I want you to hear this. You're going to die. And I'm going to die too. We're all going to die. There's a great playwright, George Bernard Shaw, who said the statistics on death are quite impressive. 1 out of 1 people die. And you know what? Even though we don't like to think about it, man, he was right. There is no escaping the fact that your life comes with an expiration date. But what Jesus does say is that even though we're all going to eventually die, each of us has the opportunity, as undeserving as we are, to experience eternal life if we choose to believe in him. And that phrase, believe in him, doesn't just mean that you believe he existed, doesn't just mean that you believe he did some cool stuff and he said some interesting things. It means to put your trust in him. It means to choose to live your life as if Jesus really was who he claimed to be, and as if everything he ever said was absolutely true. And Jesus makes the promise that when you put your trust in him, what starts out looking like a period all of a sudden becomes a comma. Because rather than being the end of the story for a follower of Jesus, death becomes a new beginning in a much better place. And then, just to make sure that they don't miss this point, Jesus looks at these 2 brokenhearted sisters and says, I want you to take me to the place where you've placed his body. And so they go to this tomb, and when they arrive there, John tells us that Jesus is so overcome with emotion that he weeps. And the question that people have struggled with for centuries is why did Jesus cry? And if you go online, if your person wants to do this, you can Google this, and you can read all kinds of opinions that people have written about why Jesus would cry. But I think they overcomplicate it, because here's the deal. What do you do? I mean, what causes you to cry? What causes you to cry? It's when something goes wrong. It's when you look around, you think, it was never supposed to be like this. And I think that's why Jesus cried that day. He knew that it wasn't supposed to be like this. And it's at that point in the story that you see the third thing that happens. Whenever Jesus is invited in, and that's that his power gives life. Check out verse 38. Jesus, once more, deeply moved, and the Greek word there means it's like the snort of a horse. He's so angry at this situation. Came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there for 4 days. Now, if you grew up going to church like I did, or you've been to any kind of funeral in the last few years, this is the part of the story that you're probably most familiar with. But keep in mind that most of the time, whenever we tell this story, or whenever we remember this story, we remember kind of a sanitized version of this story. And it's always kind of neat and clean when the real story is much different. The way we like to tell it, Jesus goes off to this tomb. He stands there, his perfectly blow-dried hair, and he's got his chin up, and he's got a single solitary tear that goes down his cheek as he cries the loss of his friend. Then he sort of gathers himself, and in his best Shakespearean voice, he says, Lazarus, come forth. And Lazarus comes out wrapped like a mummy, and the crowd goes nuts, and everybody runs up and help Lazarus, get the grave clothes off. And Lazarus hugs his sisters, and everybody goes home. They have a big potluck meal, and everybody lives happily ever after. That's kind of the way we tell the story. But the real story, much uglier than that. On one side, you have this crowd of people, some of whom are frustrated and brokenhearted, and one of whom at least is angry with God. Then you have a sealed tomb, and inside that tomb you have a body that is deep in the process of breaking down and decaying. And if you had been there that day, as soon as you heard Jesus say, take the stone away, you would have taken a big step back, just like everybody else in the crowd, because everybody knew that the moment you break the seal on that tomb, the smell of death and decay will almost knock you down. And that's why Martha says, wait a minute. Are you sure you want to do this? He's been in there for 4 days. And then look at what Jesus said in verse 40. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Think about all the things the disciples had seen. They'd seen Jesus turn water into wine. They'd seen him heal this royal official's son. They'd seen him give a paralyzed man the ability to walk. They'd seen him feed this crowd of thousands with 5 loaves and 2 fish. They'd seen him walk on water. They'd seen him give sight to the blind. But they had never seen anything like this, because there had never been anything like this. And one of the things I hope you've noticed as we've worked our way through these stories is that John was just this incredible storyteller. He gives us enough to capture our attention, but he never drowns us in the details. And the other thing he's really good at is this whole idea of foreshadowing. You see it here. In verse 4, he tells his disciples, this sickness is not going to end in death. He doesn't say that Lazarus is not going to die. He just says that's not going to be the end. And so as you read through the story, you know that something's going to happen. You just don't know what it is. And in each of these stories, he's always pointing us to something about Jesus. That's why he calls them signs, because a sign always points you to something else. And in this story, he's foreshadowing what's going to happen to Jesus. Jesus is going to go to Jerusalem. It looks like his enemies are going to win the battle. He's going to be crucified on the cross. It's going to look like the end of the story. And then 3 days later, instead of having a period at the end of that sentence, there's going to be a comma because he's going to come back. But as awesome as that is, there's something else here that John foreshadows that I don't want you to miss. And it's the fact that what happened to Lazarus is an example of what's eventually going to happen to all of us if we believe in him. And just so you know I'm not making this up, I want you to listen to the way a guy named Paul describes this in 1 Thessalonians 4. He says, brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. For we believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. According to the Lord's word, we tell you that we who are still alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command and with the voice of the archangel and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever. Therefore, encourage one another with these words. According to Paul, what looks like a period is really a comma for those who are in Christ. I told you earlier, there are certain parts of the Christmas season that I've grown to enjoy, but there's one part that I dread every year. And it's this whole deal about sending Christmas cards. I know that sounds strange, so hang with me. It's not that I don't like to receive them, and it's not that I'm too cheap to send them to other people. It's not that. It's the fact that every year, when I pull out the list of names of the people from last year that we sent cards to, as I work my way down through the list, it never takes long until I come to the name of somebody that's not here anymore. And sometimes it's more than one person. Sometimes it's a group of people. Sometimes it's a family member. Sometimes it's a friend. A lot of times it's somebody that went to church here. Some of you have the same experience. And maybe for you, as you think back over last Christmas to this Christmas, it's not just somebody you knew, it's somebody that sat at your table or somebody that you used to sit at their table. And as you cycle back through all the memories, they're in all the pictures because they were always there. One of my favorite parts of this story, most people miss it, is you keep reading, right? And you know, Lazarus comes back and there's kind of this break. And then you get to John chapter 12. And in the beginning verses of John chapter 12, Jesus is back in Bethany. And he's going through and he stops at Mary and Martha's house. And they throw this huge dinner party. I want you to look at the way John describes this. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus lived, which also happens to be the place where Lazarus had died, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, and don't miss this, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table. A name that had been marked off the list got rewritten. A seat that had once been empty was filled. A family that had once been separated was reunited. And what started out as a funeral ended as a dinner party. It's hard to think of an ending that would be more unpredictable than that one. Because what started out looking like a period was really nothing more than a comma. I want you to stand with me. As we close today, we're going to sing two final songs. And as we do, I want you to ask yourself, have I invited Jesus into the story? If you have, then he's got some things he's going to want to rewrite. If you haven't, we'd love to help you do that. If you need to make a decision, you need to talk to somebody, need to pray with somebody, maybe you're ready to get baptized, move your membership, whatever that looks like for you. David and I will be here. We'd love to talk to you. You just come down and meet us on one of these front rows, and we'll be glad to help you.